Welcome to The Humble Philosopher. So, in my last video, I proposed a thought experiment. Not sure exactly what to call it. There was a movie along these lines. I actually, in the last episode, got the title wrong. It's The Diving Jar and the Butterfly. It was a movie based on a book about a man, written by a man, who had a brain aneurysm and um, woke up with locked in syndrome. And so, locked in syndrome is total paralysis of the body except for the eyelids and movement of the eyes. And so, the purpose of this thought experiment was to show that free will and any modicum of free will, any iota of free will, is a sufficient and necessary precondition for language. And so you can turn that around and you can say that the existence of language, which I don't think anybody denies, is proof then of free will. So long as we, understand that free will isn't free will over everything, free will is free will over anything, any one thing over something. And so the reason that this is important to me personally is because I'm on YouTube a lot. And so there's levels to YouTube, and one of the levels, and it's perhaps more influential than the videos themselves, are the thumbnails, because they will just put out, chunks of information, what we sometimes call memes, that will go uncriticized, meaning that a person won't actually go down most of those rabbit holes and verify for themselves whether or not they believe the claim to be true. But there will be a strong claim, and it'll show up, and so that's sort of seeding the collective consciousness with these ideas, whether they are challenged or not. And so what I'm doing here is I'm actually challenging that level of YouTube that keeps telling me that there is no free will. And I believe that that's a very dangerous proposition, especially as formulated by somebody like Robert Sapolsky, who is saying over and over again very clearly that we have no free will. Free will is a myth, it's an illusion, it doesn't exist. Therefore, we should decide to do these things, which doesn't follow, right? There's all these absurdities that come from this idea that we have no free will that negate it on its face. Like literally, there's a Sam Harris episode, his final thoughts on free will. And before he gets into the discussion, he says, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, I understand that, this is a subject that gets a lot of people upset. So before you proceed, you have to decide, you have to be the judge as to whether or not you're ready to hear this message that you're not a judge. Like, that makes no sense, right? Nobody can be within, congruence within their own claims if they're claiming no free will. But back to this thought experiment, because I think it clearly shows that the existence of language is therefore the existence of free will, because you can't have language without free will. So broadly speaking, I was reacting to Bernardo Kastrup and analytical idealism. You could just have, just straight materialism, determinism. They're all basically saying the same thing. And I believe that, this locked in syndrome thought experiment negates all of them. Because basically everybody is saying that consciousness exists, right? It's very difficult to make a case that consciousness doesn't exist, because you need consciousness to even have that conversation. So everybody's sort of on board that consciousness exists. They will, attribute it to all sorts of, different things, mechanistic or divine or whatever. But we're all in agreement that consciousness exists. What we're not in agreement on is free will. So analytical idealism will say something on the lines that everything is subjective, and a free will reductionist, maybe like Daniel Dennett, will say that everything is material, and is just following one moment to the next. It's inherent momentum, essentially. All of these philosophies are essentially proposing a giant locked in syndrome. All right. So the thought experiment is simply this: there exists this thing called locked in syndrome that I've already defined, where a person is completely paralyzed. And paralysis means you have no voluntary muscle control over your body, except for the eyelids and vertical movement of the eyes. We can then posit one more step of paralysis, and perhaps this actually exists, where somebody is completely locked in and they have no voluntary control over their body at all. Such a person has no access to language, not languaging with the outside, because they have no voluntary control over their body. Therefore, they have no way of making their thoughts known outside of their own mind. So they are completely locked in. If we give them one modicum, one iota of free will, one way to have an on switch or an off switch, suddenly all language can flow. And that was the point I was making about the author of The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, who had locked in syndrome but was able to control his eyelids, who was able, in his hospital room with the help of his nurses, to write an entire memoir just by blinking his eyes. And so what that shows is that in order for language to flow, a mind needs some modicum of free will, and then all language can flow. When people are making determinist arguments, however, whatever they call them, whether they say that true reality is all subjective or true reality is all objective, it actually, from this perspective, doesn't make any difference. If they then deny free will, what they are arguing is that the entire universe has complete locked in syndrome. If there is no free will at all, the universe is awake, it has consciousness. We know this because we're conscious. This is happening in our conscious experience. But if it has no free will, it is completely locked in. But if it's completely locked in, it can have no access to language. The moment you give it just enough free will to blink its eyes, all of a sudden, language flows. And since the world is replete with language, right? DNA is a language. Mathematics is argued is a language. Language exists. Therefore, free will must exist. So, this is just the humble philosopher. What this is just an outlet for me. This is just one window of free will for me to share my ideas. I was digging a little bit deeper into Bernardo Kastrup and his analytical idealism, and how deterministic it is or it isn't. And actually he equivocates and he says, well, you have free will in the sense that you can choose your best mortgage. Well, that's free will, and that's quite a bit of free will. It's more free will than any other animal on the planet has, but it's free will. And the problem with free will from a scientific perspective is just nobody knows really what that means. It's only definable by a tautology. It's also the same problem with consciousness. It's like consciousness. What is consciousness? You can only describe consciousness as other words for consciousness, awareness, etc. But perhaps free will is even more problematic because it's consciousness choosing to move matter some way. Somewhere in that domino chain of physical material events. And I think we get confused sometimes by calling what we mean to be material or mechanistic physical. Since there's a physics to empty space, I even think there's a physics to spirit, to the spiritual realm. But what we typically mean in science is the material and the mechanism. And here's this thing that completely violates everything we know about material and mechanism. And what we want to do is be able to trace the domino chain back and find that thing, and it eludes us. And so those who argue against free will are just doing so because they think that's the most adult thing. They think that's the most scientific thing, even though, that itself is just a presupposition. It's just a belief. But run the experiment. If you're locked inside your body and you have no voluntary control, you have no access to languaging with the outside world. Freeze your mind and you disappear. Give yourself any modicum, any window of control, of free will, and suddenly you can language. But it is the precondition. There is no language where there is not some iota of free will. And since there's language all around us, and since we come from language, right, which is DNA, that language could only have flowed forth if there was a window of free will. And so, me personally, yes, I believe in free will and I believe in God. And I know that that gets frowned upon, and that's automatically you're sort of just excluded from some of these more quote unquote serious schools of philosophy. But that's why I'm here, the humble philosopher, just giving my take. So I hope that's helpful to somebody somewhere. Thanks for tuning in.